Thank you for watching the video, everyone. I'm Thomas Hollander, the president, soon to be former president of the Kyoto chapter of JALT, member of the Diversity and Equity Practices Committee of JALT, also associate professor of English education at Nara University of Education, and the proud interviewer of Dr. Professor Associate Dean. I'm sorry, which title should I use?
Yeah, whatever you would like.
Okay, Dr. Professor, all around wonderful person, Luciana de Oliveira from Virginia Commonwealth University, who is one of our incredible plenary speakers at the JALT 2021 conference. For anyone who doesn't know, she is Associate Dean of Academic Affairs and Professor at Virginia Commonwealth. She was Professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning at the University of Miami in Miami, Florida, and she served as Chair of the Department of Teaching and Learning from 2016 until 2020. She was a board member and president of TESOL International, and she was the first Latina to serve as the president of the organization. Now, her research focuses on issues related to teaching emergent to advanced bilinguals at the K through 12 level, including the role of language in learning, content areas, and teacher education and advocacy and social justice. So we're really happy to have you as one of our plenary speakers. I personally have been wanting to get you as a speaker for quite some time, and I'm really glad that we finally were able to do so. To prepare for our interview, I spoke with some other teachers and teacher trainers here in Japan and East Asia who work with K through 12 teacher education. And the questions that I'll be asking today include some of theirs as well as some of my own, because I think these are issues that I think a lot of your audience is going to really want to hear more about. So without further ado, let's get going.
Sounds good.
First, would you like to share briefly your journey of becoming an academic in literacy education and English language teaching? You had said you were from a small city outside of Sao Paulo, Brazil?
That's right, yes. Thanks so much again to JALT for the invitation to be a plenary speaker this year. And just a little background, yes, so I'm from Brazil originally. Brazil is a big country. I'm from the southeast of the state of São Paulo, so in the southeast of Brazil, and it's so I'm from a relative small city compared to São Paulo and some other big cities in Brazil. It's called Araraquara, and that's where I went to school. So I went to undergrad there, and I taught English for 4 years while I was doing my undergrad in English and Portuguese. I have sort of like a dual major and a minor in German. So I learned lots of different things, and I was able to do a research project there on cohesive devices in writing. And that's how I got interested in this theory of language that I use in my work. So it was actually during my undergrad years. And then I moved to the US, did a master's in TESOL, and then a PhD in education with a focus on language literacy and culture, and an additional specialization in second language acquisition. And I've been, in academia for about 15 years now, and really, it's been a wonderful experience, and have worked with a lot of teachers in classrooms. My research is really in classrooms with teachers. I really enjoy working with especially general education teachers who have multilingual learners in their classrooms. So those who are either classified as English language learners or those who are also bilingual students who do not receive perhaps language support outside of the classroom or in the classroom, but are still they're still learning English, even though they may have exited those ESL services, English as a second language services.
So you mentioned the theory of language that you were working with. And so for people who aren't familiar with that theory of language, so terms like genre-based or language-based or text-based pedagogy, like you mentioned in the abstract for your workshop. Those terms can seem unfamiliar or even intimidating. Can you give a brief explanation or example of what this kind of teaching is, what it involves?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So the theory of language that I use in my work is called systemic functional linguistics. And it was developed by Michael Halliday and, now many other scholars, both in Australia and here in the US, all over the world, really. Many scholars in Brazil also have used this theory not only for research, but also for pedagogical applications in the classroom. And the work on genre-based pedagogies really has been developed by Jim Martin and many others at the University of Sydney and all over Australia, and again, also picked up here in the US over the past, I would say, 25 to 30 years. And one of the major scholars in the US is my PhD advisor, Mary Schleppergrell. And so, having worked with her, I have really developed my knowledge base on pedagogical implications and applications of this theory in classrooms. And the notion of genre is really critical for what we do in classrooms. And we really talk about, how genre, we talk about this concept of genre as key to the teaching of literacy. And genre is defined as what we call a staged, goal-oriented social process. So that means, it could be a little bit confusing for people, but it's staged because it usually takes us more than one phase of meaning to work through a genre. It's goal-oriented because we're always thinking about these unfolding phases to accomplish something. And we really need to think about what the purpose of the genre is. And social because we undertake genres interactively with others. So we use this notion of genre with a pedagogical tool that we call the teaching and learning cycle, which is actually what I'm going to talk about in one of my presentations at JALT. And to implement specifically writing instruction, but it really is literacy pedagogy. So we have worked with teachers to implement the TLC, so teaching and learning cycle, the TLC, in elementary classrooms here in the US with great success. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about during my second presentation, which is a workshop on genre-based writing instruction.
Okay, I think a lot of teachers in Japan and a lot of programs and curricula in Japan that at least I'm familiar with will often use the word language teaching. You don't often see literacy instruction. So where does literacy, I know that's really figurative and really key to lots of SFL-based pedagogies. Where does that come from and why is that so important?
So this notion of focusing on literacy, you're really talking about not just one language perhaps, or one, we talk about language as a resource for meaning making. So we're really talking about different strategies for the teaching of language. And typically what we do here in the US is focus on language teaching in content classrooms, so that general education teachers are also focusing on language. And it's not just the responsibility of the language teacher to develop students' knowledge about language, even though that's definitely a major piece of it. So we think of it as, trying to help all teachers understand that language is a critical piece of teaching about language. Because as Halliday talks about it, we teach language, we teach through language, and we teach about language. And typically the teaching about language may be the job of the EFL or the ESL expert, but you are teaching through language when you are a general education teacher, for example. So thinking about how to use those strategies for focusing on language and content simultaneously can be really, really powerful for everyone. And you are really addressing the literacy needs of students when you are focusing on language in this way.
Okay, so literacy doesn't just mean teaching reading in this.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
So it involves, multimodal ways of meaning making. So it really goes beyond just a focus on reading, for example. It really it encompasses different skills, and you want to also use multimodality, which can be really, really powerful when you are addressing language.
What can teachers in EFL contexts like Japan learn from language and literacy programs developed in English-dominant countries like the US? And how can that be done?
Yeah, so one of the, I think, major misconceptions perhaps about teaching literacy or focusing on language is not using students' home languages in the classroom. And that has been a pattern, I think, over the past several years in the TESOL field, that you need to focus on English only. But what we have seen in a lot of classrooms here in the US context is really that using students' home languages as resources in the classroom can be really, really powerful for the development of English, and also for building on what students already know and improving also their knowledge of their home languages. So people may have this conception in EFL context that using students' home languages should not be done in classrooms, but what we have seen here is that it can really be very powerful. And so if people watching this interview, they may have questions about that. They may say, oh, but then teachers will only use students' home languages. And so what I talk about is, being judicious about your use of students' home languages. You still want to focus on the development of English, right? In this case, but you can use students' home languages as resources. So you're not forgetting where students are coming from or where students are, in terms of their language development, because they do have knowledge of their home languages, right? So this idea of using students' home languages as resources is really, really critical, and is part of what has been called in the literature culturally sustaining teaching practices. So what are these culturally sustaining teaching practices for the teaching of English? And I think that part of it is really using students' home languages in the classroom, and again, as resources for learning English, and also to help them continue to develop their own home language backgrounds.
I want to just briefly ask about two terms that you've been using throughout the interview that some of our viewers may not be familiar with, which is the notion of language as a resource, and also the fact that you're talking about language development, not language acquisition. This is a key difference. So I'm curious if you could go into those a little bit.
Yeah, so we talk a lot about as language as resource, meaning that we think of language as a system of choices. So you're using language to do something, to accomplish something. And so, it goes back to the notion of genre, right? So that's what we mean by using language as a resource, and thinking of, using all of what students bring to the classroom, their linguistic repertoires. Maybe that's another word that we can use. Mm-hmm. So what it is that they already have in order to develop additional resources, right? Additional language that they may need in order to participate in society, let's say. So this other notion of language development is really important. We don't talk so much about language acquisition because we focus a lot on the social nature of language. So what it means to develop these resources is really through interaction with the teacher, through interaction with other students in the classroom. So we have this, when we talk about genre and genre-based pedagogy, the principle that we use is what we call guidance through interaction in the context of shared experiences. So this notion of providing guidance through interaction, so you are developing language. It's not something that just happens within your brain, right? It is social. So this interaction piece and what teachers do with students in the classroom is really, really critical. Through shared experiences, that's another big concept that I will be talking more about in both my plenary and also the workshop. So this shared experience, when students bring to the classroom, you are building on what they already bring. And you want to provide a shared experience for them to be able to read about, write about, speak, listen. So this notion of shared experiences is also really, really critical. So this idea of language development is mainly connected to, again, this notion of the social nature of language. So I hope that clarifies a little bit.
Okay, I think it does. And what was the model that you talked? I've forgotten. So, because in systemic functional linguistics, we talk about field, the tenor, and mode, and that sends people rushing back to their master's, linguistics introduction courses. But you have a much more perhaps handy and useful way of talking about that. What was that again?
Yes, so for the past 15 years or so, I've been working with general education teachers in classrooms in various states here in the US, and I've developed a teacher education model that I call a language-based approach to content instruction, and the acronym is LACI. So a language-based approach to content instruction, and the guiding practices around LACI really focus on 6 C's of support for scaffolding. And the 6 C's of support are connection, culture, code breaking, challenge, community and collaboration, and classroom interactions. And so you can Google my name, Lacey, and you can find articles about this model that is really around the 6 C's of support for scaffolding. And as part of code breaking, that's where I focus a lot on genre-based pedagogy, on this language focus in content classrooms where we integrate. So the focus is really on developing academic literacy as language and content integration as inseparable instructional components. And as part of that, what I have done is really focus on 3 key areas of meaning, what I call. So content, relationships, and organization. So as part of the teaching and learning cycle, we focus on detailed reading or building content knowledge of the topic. And we can really address, like, for content, we ask questions such as what is happening, who are the things or people involved, what are the circumstances surrounding events. For relationships, we talk about what are the roles and relationships taken up by participants. And for organization, we ask the question, how is the text organized and structured? How is the language used? So you can see some connections with SFL if you're familiar with SFL, but we try to make it, a little bit more accessible for teachers to really see that we are focusing on these 3 key areas of meaning. And actually, I just happen to have this book here, but these are further developed in this book that I co-wrote with my PhD advisor, Mary Schleppergrell, Focus on Grammar and Meaning, where we talk more about these three key areas of meaning.
All right, thank you. And actually that gets into my next question. So talking about teacher development and teacher training. So what, and especially K through 12, and especially elementary primary school level EFL teachers, what are some of the basics that you think that these elementary and primary school EFL teachers should be taught as a student teacher before they enter the classroom? Because in Japan especially, teacher education is something that really needs a lot of development. As you may know, English as a subject has only relatively recently been introduced into Japanese primary schools, and the curriculum for teacher education is still in the developing stages, and there's still lots of kinks to be worked out. So for people who are developing those programs, who are developing those teachers, who are really sort of setting the groundwork for teacher education for primary school EFL teachers in Japan, what are some of the things that you think that those teachers need to know before they step into the classroom?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. I think it would take us half a day to answer
just one or two.
That, but I'll give you just a couple of things that I think really are critical. So just knowing more about second language development in general is really, really important for teachers. So especially if you are focusing on the teaching of English, right? So knowing about second language development more generally. I think another area would be, how to integrate language and content in the way that I was kind of talking about. So it connects to your other question about, what you can learn from the research that has been done here in the US or other more English dominant countries, right? So you can think about it as, this integration of language and content. So using content to teach language, I think it's really, really powerful, and, that you can do across elementary, secondary, and at the university level if you are using more English as a medium of instruction approaches at the university level, which are very popular now around the world. So really focusing on perhaps those two key pieces would be very important. And connected to that, developing teachers' knowledge about language. So not just that they're teaching language, but they're teaching through language and they're teaching about language. So this goes back to what Halliday talks about, these three areas, right? So teaching language, teaching through language, and teaching about language. So, developing teachers' knowledge about language is really important. Also developing their own language proficiency is very important. So that sometimes becomes the focus of teacher education, is developing students who are going to be teachers, right? These teacher candidates, language proficiency, and that becomes the sole focus of a teacher education program. And what we have found working in other EFL contexts is that you have to develop teachers' language proficiency, but at the same time, talk about how they're going to be teaching that language to their future students. So it's not just about developing the language proficiency of these teacher candidates, but it's also about helping them see how they're going to be teaching this language. So that's why this notion of developing teachers' knowledge about language is really, really important. So it's not just developing their language itself, but also developing their knowledge about teaching about language and teaching through language. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes a lot of sense. It's also, as you said, it's something you can be talked about for half a day, if not longer. Finally, Um, I'm curious about this type of teaching that you're advocating about this. How does this connect to this type of teaching? How does this and the research, and how does it connect to issues of social justice? You mentioned this is comments that I got from your own personal introduction, your own personal website. How does it connect to social justice? And you mentioned especially your experience as a Latina educator in TESOL. You mentioned that you're the first Latina president of TESOL International, which is tremendous. And given the history of linguistic imperialism and issues of race and racialization in our field, as in all fields influenced by settler colonialism, these are issues that our entire field is grappling with, and they're very, very contested right now. And I'm curious, speaking as someone who, if it's not obvious to the viewers, has a deep knowledge of SFL and SFL-based pedagogies. That's how I met Dr. Oliveira. She was one of the readers for my dissertation. Thank you very much again. But genre-based pedagogy has always been a very socially justice aware and oriented form of teaching. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to that and to perhaps your own personal journey as well, if possible.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think that what we do with genre-based pedagogy and, everything that we have done in classrooms with teachers has really had equity as a guiding principle, right? So equity, and again, developing, using what students bring to the classroom to develop additional language resources to help them participate in new situations. So the whole principle, again, of using these kinds of pedagogies in the classroom really focuses on equity. And so it is extremely connected to social justice, because we feel like we're adding, it's an asset-based approach. So, and an additive-based approach. So, or an additive approach, I should say, because we are using what students bring to the classroom to make connections to new understandings, to build what they already know. So the whole notion of LACY and the sea of connection and the sea of culture really draw on what students bring to the classroom to help them develop new linguistic resources, to develop new languages, right? So not just English, but maybe additional languages that they're interested in as well. So it really centers around social justice, because we feel like we are adding to what they already know, so they can participate in new situations, and have, new opportunities because of that. So it really is an important piece. Now, to me personally, I have gone through experiences of linguistic racism, for example, here in the US, right? So not being given certain classes because I was considered, quote unquote, a non-native English speaker. So having the ability to show that I myself have those resources to be able to teach. I do have the language proficiency to be able to teach, was really important from the beginning of my career here in the US. So I feel a very strong connection to that as well, based on my own personal experiences. And also, it is very important to, again, make sure that we know that we come to this work knowing a different language or more languages. So that is not, should not be considered a problem, but instead it should be seen as an asset to everything that we do. So being bilingual or multilingual in many cases is really an amazing piece of what we can do in the classroom, for what we do for our experiences in the classroom with students. So I think I would connect those two in that sense.
Yeah, there's we talked before we started the recording about the notion that still seems to be prevalent about that we're developing another monolingual on top of one that
Monolingual.
already exists. And there's certainly the concept of the idea of translanguaging is quite in vogue in our field, but what that actually means in practice is still up in the air, and how that works. And you're teaching your pedagogy that you'll be advocating and telling us more at your plenary and your workshop will show us how that can actually be used in practice. So thank you very, very much. Do you have anything else to say to everyone before we go?
Just that I'm really looking forward to being with everyone virtually soon. And I wish I could be there in person, because I've never been to Japan, and I would just love to be there in person. So maybe in the future I can do that.
We certainly hope
but I'm
so.
really looking, yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much. Oh, and you're going to be traveling very soon, going back to Brazil, you said? Right.
Yes.
Well, pleasant journeys, and we look forward to seeing you at the conference.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much again, and see you soon.
Thank you.